I've gone full partridge.
You never go full partridge.
Welcome to this week's episode of Escape Pod from Escape Technology, where we discuss the pressing technology issues of the day being faced by VFX and content creation studios. This week, we are discussing the use of cloud infrastructure and remote cloud resources for visual effects workflows. My special guest today is Colin Kennedy, CEO of Fix VFX. Good morning, Colin. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
And we have Nick Matthews with us, our Business Development Director. Morning to you, Nick.
Good morning, Jason.
Hello, good morning and welcome. All right, so we're going to talk about Escape's Sherpa platform and its deployment as a cloud resource management tool for VFX workflows, which is relevant to Fix VFX. But I think before we get into that, we'd really like to hear a little bit more about Fix as a company. So, Colin, could you give us a bit of background about Fix and tell us who you are and the type of projects you work on?
Yeah, sure. So Fix will be 5 years old this year. It came about from when I was working on a movie that I was directing, and in the post process, I ended up running a small room of artists, and the post production supervisor said, "You're actually pretty good at this." And I was like, "Well, that's very nice of you." And he said, "You should start a visual effects company in Glasgow." And I said, in no uncertain terms, that was a ridiculous idea and it was never going to happen. And 5 years later, here we are. And the way that there was an opportunity that came up, there was a fund at Screen Scotland, as it's known now, to train people up. And there's very limited access to visual effects in Scotland. But we have a great pool of education. So we've got lots of clever young people coming out of university and looking for interesting jobs. And there's a gap between education and what how well equipped students are when they graduate and what the industry needs. So I applied to the training fund and they gave me some money, and I built a bespoke course with Escape Studios. And then from that point on, we put those young minds and talents to work in kind of entry level jobs. So lots of roto prep, paint work, green screen, and essentially we've set up as a VFX outsource facility. Although we tend to work better as a vendor, so on larger projects like Outlaw King or Outlander, anything that starts with out, we'll work on that.
Only projects that start with the word out.
Yeah, it's got to start with out, otherwise we're out. So yeah, on bigger projects, we work very well as a vendor, direct, and on smaller projects, we work equally well as a VFX outsource. And we fit, obviously, because we're in the UK, we fit very well with UK tax credit. All our spend is eligible. We're not directly competitive price-wise with other areas of the world, like the Far East or India, but we don't have any of the time zone issues. We don't have any tech issues either. So we're a very easy company to work with, and we've got great talent.
So are you, just give us a bit more insight in terms of the types of projects, Colin. I mean, are we talking predominantly film and long-form drama, or do you do commercials? Is there a mixture? What's the story with that?
It's all film and long-form drama.
Okay. We
don't tend to work too well for commercials because it's short-form work, or certainly in our experience, the type of commercials that have approached us is that they're really looking for a kind of one-man solution or a very small team solution that takes them from that does all of the kind of fiddly roto work right the way through to the high end finishing work, and our model doesn't really work terribly well for that. We're a lot better at getting the kind of nuts and bolts work done to a really high degree of fastidiousness. And then if you've got lots of CG work to do, then go to a CG specialist. we're better at the kind of nuts and bolts end of it.
Yeah, so as befits a sort of outsourcing model, it's where in commercials you've got fewer artists that are generalists and are working across the whole pipeline. That's not going to fit your model quite so well. That makes sense. And so tell me, what does Fix look like? I mean, I'm getting a picture that perhaps we haven't got 30 people sitting in a single studio space geographically. What's the sort of layout in that respect?
So the way that it was run pre-COVID-19 was that we have a small studio in Glasgow, and that ramps up and down. And we, I think, grew up to our biggest last year, working on Outlander, having about 25 people. And some of those were other outsource companies that we work with well. But predominantly that's freelancers working with us. So we would have 8 in the studio and then other people working remotely. So in terms of making the jump to remote working, we were starting to get a bit of a break on that last year, simply by the necessity to grow the studio quickly and not having talent immediately available in Glasgow, or space for that matter.
Right, okay. And so touching upon the sort of more specific technology questions there then, what applications and tool sets are your artists using typically?
The absolute base tool that everything is founded on is Nuke. From there, we also use tracking products, PF Track, 3D Equalizer, Maya to deliver Alembic files, Neat Video is another important plugin, Mocha for planar tracking, and Adobe Creative Suite on a kind of more minimal level.
Sure. So it's a pretty expected sort of software palette of VFX tools. Yeah. So how have you unified the project technically when you've had a group of full-time artists sitting in the Glasgow studio and then you've had artists scattered around all over the place? What technology have you used previously to kind of unite those projects, with a kind of underlying infrastructure?
Well, in the studio, it's very simple. We have a server on premises. It is only connected to, well, it's never directly connected to the internet. But we have a system where we download our files through Aspera or Signiant or whatever clients like to use. Yeah. And then everybody accesses from a central server. We did have node-locked licenses for Nuke on each of the workstations. So that was how things worked in the studio. Then for the cloud infrastructure, we used Athera, which was a great solution for what we needed to do. It worked really well, but it wasn't taken up widely enough across the industry for it to be sustainable. So they closed it down, and that actually pretty much coincided with the end of our project and need for remote workers. And since then, as you know, we've been looking at Sherpa.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Athera, which is the Foundry's, or was the Foundry's own Foundry product, emphasized cloud containerized sort of workflow tool. I think we'll come back to that in a second. I just want to hand over to Nick for a second and ask him a couple of questions. I mean, Nick, you had been, what's your history with Fix, and how did you end up having conversations with Colin about the next stage for those guys with respect to their remote deployment?
As Colin mentioned, we were introduced by Andy Bressington at Escape Studios, who'd known Colin for a number of years, and they had already successfully deployed a cloud-based solution with Foundry's Athera, and were looking for an alternative solution to provide them with a continued cloud infrastructure service. And after some R&D time and an extended evaluation period, it was agreed that it was suitable for them to be able to stand up the infrastructure they need to do.
So really, it was a question of you coming up with something that was going to provide them with the same flexibility and agility that Athera had provided previously.
Yes, I mean, in fact, Sherpa is a far more adaptable solution than Athera. The whole ethos and design concept behind Sherpa was to build an entirely agnostic open stack solution that could leverage the power of any any hardware stack, either one that's considered to be a cloud hardware stack or even a private virtual cluster of hardware running in someone's machine room or a data center. And we can install any software. I mean, it's not even limited to what we would consider to be computer graphics software, but I have people using it for a whole range of remote compute solutions.
Yeah, okay. This interesting point with Athera I'd like to pick up on, actually. I mean, Colin, Nick's mentioned the fact that Athera had been largely developed to provision Foundry software products in a cloud format. Did you encounter any limitations with that, where you needed to use sort of Maya and applications that sat outside of the Foundry's toolset range? What was your experience on that front?
At that point, it wasn't really an issue for us, but it certainly would have been an issue going forward. I mean, I have a vision for Fix that it is a visual effects studio entirely based in the cloud, and for that, obviously, we will need access to a variety of software. And as Nick quite rightly points out, not necessarily just graphic stuff, but, project management tools, Google Docs or Word, or, all the business, the logistics.
Yeah, the business continuity stuff. Well. Yeah.
So that would not have been possible, to my knowledge, in Athera. And we would have had lots of different systems running side by side. Now, what is interesting to us about Sherpa is that because of its agnostic position, it means that we can literally go about building our studio in a virtual world with all the tools that we want. But in terms of timing, which is absolutely critical, it's actually come, this whole change in the world has come at a relatively good time for us. We're just finishing up on a big job. We've got a little gap between now and our next work. The next work has an animation element to it, so that can carry on in what would have been pre-production until ways and means of returning to physical production are dealt with. So we do have time to develop a solution that takes our company, on a solid foundation into a almost dedicated cloud infrastructure.
Yeah, and I guess businesses like yours are going to be viewed a little bit differently, as in more positively, going forwards. I mean, the world has shifted on its axis a little with the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, did you encounter previously questions or curiosity from your clients about the remote distributed nature of your setup before?
Well, and sorry to talk over you there. I mean, another benefit to this will be that the security side of things. Security audit for our previous premises had a lot of kind of physical problems to it. With everything in the cloud, it's a relatively straightforward checkbox approach. Are you using industry accepted standards for file transfer, for storage, and for access? And the simple answer to that is a yes on every level. Because we can't set it up without using those industry standard protocols. So it really makes that whole transition a lot easier.
Yeah, I guess to some extent your ability to fulfill security mandates are sort of aided really by the fact that you're using cloud components, which all bring with them their own ability to fulfill security restrictions. As
completely.
Google, Microsoft, Amazon all have their own ability to meet those requirements, and providing your network is sort of has a degree of integrity when you plug into them, you're covered in that regard, aren't you?
Yeah, and you have to go through all sorts of security. Jump through security hoops, just to get on the system. And I guess the one hole that there is going to be, and is always going to be there, is that there will be viewable pixels on artists' screens. But otherwise, it should be a pretty watertight system.
Yeah, we talked about that with Barry Zubel from LipSync actually in a previous podcast episode, where obviously in this sort of new normal, you've got this scenario where there's a screen with pixels displayed in an artist's domestic environment, but of course everybody's having to wrestle with that at the moment. So again, it becomes an accepted sort of facet of those sorts of workflows, really.
Sure.
What are you doing to manage the production aspect of your project? So obviously you've got artists working remotely with their visual effects applications. I mean, for shot management or control of the project, where do you centralize all of that? What tools do you use for that?
We started out with Shotgun, and it worked very well, but we weren't really, using its full capability. Then we moved to F-Track because one of our close companies that we work with was using F-Track, and I personally found it quite difficult to learn another shot management system, and I couldn't really extract the kind of data that I wanted from it very easily. And then I created my own Google Sheet with just what I wanted on it, and that's what we use. We started out with the biggest guns that the industry has to offer, and then in the end, actually, it turns out with a very simple bit of coding and learning how to work Google Sheets, you can link everything together. It calculates all our bids. It calculates all our worker time. People's time at work. And then we can really mine that data very, very easily. So it's a completely bespoke system. Now, in the future, I think we would like to go back to Shotgun, but at the moment, Google Sheets is ace.
That's interesting because it sort of ties in with what you said earlier about non-VFX applications being brought into the Sherpa infrastructure as just the same as sort of Maya or Nuke. But in terms of returning to Shotgun, I presume that you envisage the team sizes being larger and the projects becoming more complex, and that will necessitate you pivoting back to that kind of solution, I guess.
That's it. I mean, essentially what I want to be able to do is scale and shrink, depending on what the needs of the company are, and depending on what the workload is. But essentially, I'd like to be able to scale quickly and painlessly. So I need a solution that artists can join the company and get on with their work as easily as possible. So essentially, I want the technological side of things to be almost invisible. I don't want them to be thinking about, how does this work? Where do I save my work? All of these considerations. I want to try and take as much of that thought time away from the artist as possible so they can focus on their work. Now, if we can use something like Shotgun to allocate shots, control the nomenclature of a shot, the versions, all of that, right nodes to upload and save work to the right places in all the various different codecs and formats and shapes that are needed, and then automatically upload them to the people that need to see them. And if all of that can be controlled by a visual effects producer, then that's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, to change tack slightly and talk about competition and to a degree, financial sustainability, not to dirty the conversation with talk of money, but in terms of what's your view on that? Because presumably without an expensive, say, London studio, I know you're Glasgow based, but an expensive London studio and a great deal of on-premise technology and so on and so forth, that has a benefit in terms of agility and cost in terms of bidding on projects and winning work, presumably. I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's a big change in terms of your financial economic strategy. So currently, as you rightly point out, studios tend to be working on a CapEx model. So there's lots of kit, there's lots of desks, chairs, all of which are considered to be assets from an accounting perspective.
Yeah.
And this change is to very much an operational model. So your tech, in fact, becomes a similar resource like your artists. Now, in a world where the tech side of things is so fast changing, it's actually quite difficult to argue that a computer is an asset, because its shelf life
is shortening.
Yeah, exactly. So it changes very quickly. Now, so if you can give that headache to somebody else, then that's fine. So we're operational now. But the advantage to that should be that you can just turn things on and off when you need them. So you should have a greater control over your costs.
Yeah, and are able to, price your jobs accordingly, I guess.
Now we'll only be able to tell over time which one is more efficient. We just haven't done enough work on in that basis to be able to tell you. But next year, I'll let you know.
Well, maybe we'll have another conversation on the podcast next year and find out what the outcome's been. So what has changed for you with the restrictions under the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, you did mention that you'd come to the end of a job anyway, but and it's given you some planning time. But what are your thoughts around how that will affect what you do going forwards?
Well, in a physical space, obviously, you can see each other, you can talk to each other. It's easier to build a community, to build relationships, to maintain those relationships, to see if somebody is struggling with something, if somebody's not feeling great, or needs some emotional help or whatever. If somebody's getting tired or somebody's getting bored of a job, do we need to move them onto something else? We are tribal beasts, so there's a very obvious physical barrier in place at the moment that makes it very difficult to maintain those relationships within the team. Now we're using Slack at the moment to do that, and we talk to each other all day. We're quite used to that to some extent because we've had remote artists in the past, and it's always been part of our model. So we're kind of used to dealing with people over the internet. But yeah, that I would say is the most obvious challenge.
It's quite nice to hear you say that. Actually, I think we've had various conversations on the podcast with people about remote working per se, but also under the restrictions with the health crisis. And I think it'd be very nice to work for you. Actually, it's quite a concerned and sensitive thing to say about your team. The lack of human contact means you miss that someone might be struggling or someone might be tired or need a helping hand. It's more difficult to have that insight, isn't it, when you're not sitting in the same room as somebody? But it's fair to say, presumably, that your structure was remote and cloud reliant before the pandemic, and it will remain that way. It will just add further credence to the way that you've decided to set up Fix VFX.
Yes, I mean, like I said before, it's been an aim to have a completely cloud-based facility. For a small company that's not using a massive amount of computing and rendering power, it feels like now is a good time to get involved in it on a dedicated level. And like I say, we've got a little bit to invest in this, and it's not break the bank kind of stuff. So while there's a bit of time and while there's a little bit of capital to invest, it seems like a good thing for us to do.
Yeah, okay. Nick, I'm interested in some of the conversations you've been having about Sherpa with studios like Fix, but others too, because I know that you've been very active in talking to a wide number of studios over the last several weeks as this crisis has started to bite a bit deeper in terms of restrictions and impact. Could you give us a bit of insight into the sorts of discussions you've been having around suggesting something like Sherpa and some of the challenges that your contacts in the VFX industry have been facing?
So yes, first, I mean, the conversations were certainly pre-existing by a number of months or even years prior to the current situation. We delivered a number of projects previously, but it was slightly more resource intensive for us. But yes, as you rightly point out, there's certainly been an increased interest and requirement given the current situation. And it has allowed a number of studios to continue working and to have access to resources that they didn't have available to them directly after having to send everybody away from the physical studio. And what we discovered is many studios didn't actually have anything in place to allow for remote working at any serious scale. Mm-hmm. So some of the conversations have been about how to leverage their physical kit and access that remotely. But it's naturally led into conversations such as this to how could we provision an entirely virtual studio for people. And so we actually, in a number of situations, the studios elected to use Sherpa as an alternative to this so that they had business continuity over this 6-week period, 8-week period. Time will tell how long period.
Well, that's quite interesting. So what you're saying there is that Sherpa is being used to get around the problem because it gives you the ability to have everything contained in a cloud deployment.
Exactly. It's a sort of plan B solution to get them around those restrictions. This has probably been explored in other podcasts, but the physical size of the internet connection in and out of people's building has a maximum number of users that it can support.
Yeah. And
typically this is under provisioned for the amount of remote working that people need now, I guess is the simplest way to put it. That's
what they had before isn't quite fit for purpose given the amount of remote workers they now might need to spin up. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's nobody's fault. It just wasn't really a requirement before. So it was adequate for what they needed, but not sufficient for what they needed now. And so given the current situation, it was basically, deal with what you've got. And, obviously people couldn't go in to do any work or, all those kind of things. The timescale just wasn't there to be able to increase their infrastructure in and out the building. But obviously certain projects which were underway still had to be delivered, and especially given the current climate and the consumption of content, there's all the more pressure on them to deliver their projects. So this allowed them to very simply create a mirror to their existing kit, which they could use during this time period and then stand down at the end of the project and carry on, hopefully, onto the next project.
Okay. Nick, can I ask a question? How have these big companies got round the licensing issue?
Licensing issues on the software?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways. I mean, the obvious route, if they're scaling up beyond their existing size, is just to purchase the minimum required license term, a monthly license or less if it's a render license. And we can build a virtual license server in the cloud. That's one approach. Or if the period was going to be long enough, you could request from your license provider that the licenses are recut to the virtual license server. Or the short-term solution that we can do when there's a combination of an on-premise infrastructure and the cloud infrastructure is to connect via a VPN from the physical license server up to the virtual cloud infrastructure, allowing you to access and authorize those licenses.
Yeah, it's a good question actually from Colin, because what's interesting about the way that technology moves is that sometimes not all aspects of the technology landscape move at the same pace. I mean, some of the software companies are less agile than others insofar as not having really any policy for cloud deployment, or if they do, it anchors to a user license agreement that was originally conceived for a world that we're fast moving away from. That being, it's all on premise, it's all anchored to a business location. But as Nick says, I think there are ways of still abiding by those licensing agreements and enabling a cloud deployment, without getting into hot water. So, Colin, flipping back to you for a second, we've asked everybody on the podcast this question because it's obviously current and over and beyond things as they relate directly to Fix. What do you think are the longer term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on post-production and visual effects? What do you think the legacy of that is going to be as we move beyond social distancing or beyond the lockdown and into whatever comes next?
Well, I mean, there's going to be a lag in production, like I say, well, in physical production, and we don't know how physical production is actually going to look as a thing. It's very unlikely to be like the film sets that we were used to before. I think that potentially there's a big opportunity for visual effects companies in that talking to the production community, I've been hearing about reduced crews, social distancing, all having an effect on the way that production works. So one thing that I'm interested in is creating previs. And when I say that, I mean going out with one person to look at your location and make a 3D model of it, and then being able to look at it either through a headset or just through 3D software, picking out your angles, exactly picking out all your shots, storyboarding them together in an animated form, and then greatly reducing the amount of time that you need to spend on set. Your edit's pretty much done or largely done to a degree, reducing the amount of stuff that the art department needs to build, and then on the closer angles from your crude model, starting to work up your full res 4K set extensions and all that kind of stuff. So crowds are going to be a problem. So working out good solutions for any crowd work that you need to do on the set. It's there's some good opportunities there, but it's definitely going to look like a very different place for quite some time.
Yeah, so there's likely to be an increase in some respects in VFX requirements to sort of underwrite where there's been less shooting or there are less physical plates.
I mean, we can help reduce the impact on the set. Take away some of the pressures.
And Nick, what's your take on that? You're obviously talking to a very wide spectrum of content creation studios throughout visual effects and even visualization and architectural spaces. What are you hearing from those guys?
I guess it's a slightly crystal ball sort of question. It's hard to know specifically. I mean, it certainly opened the eyes to a number of companies about the possibility and the potential of remote working. I'd say that's a given. For whatever the reasons, commercial or cultural, it typically wasn't something that was really entertained previously, certainly in a lot of the bigger VFX shops. And it's definitely highlighted that it's an option.
Greater tolerance of it perhaps now. Yeah,
greater tolerance, greater understanding. It sort of exploded the myth that it wasn't possible to sort of work in a pipeline type fashion with people working remotely, and perhaps exploded the myth that people thought it wasn't technically possible, due to whatever the restrictions were. Whether or not that gives a long-term wholesale change, I couldn't say, but I certainly think it could be disruptive to the landscape. Typically, as you've mentioned earlier, and the sort of model that Colin's outlined, a very large number of studios and post-production houses are located in Zone 1 prime real estate in cities across the world. Tend to have very high base costs, as in their rent and rates are very high. Typically, the spaces are limited in physical size, and rent has continued to increase over time. And I think that it may open up the potential for the shape of these companies to change, perhaps. And there have been companies that have explored this option before. You may see more companies adopting this model where they move a bulk of their workforce out to a more remote location on the outskirts of town, and just have a smaller series of suites, perhaps, in the centre of town.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's good news for Glasgow, right, Colin? I think. I mean, I'm interested in that too, because so much stuff is London-centric, and so many VFX companies are anchored or in London's orbit. And although this is a bit of a tangent, it is interesting and nice to deal with studios that are based in other locations. Do you have to meet clients in London?
Yes, I do have to meet clients in London, and most of our work comes from London or via London from Los Angeles. But part of our attraction is that we're still very much based in the UK, so it's good for UK tax credit. It's building on the industry in this country, and we're, well, like I was talking about our artists, we look after people. We like to create opportunities. We're nursery slopes potentially for people that want to then go on and do more complex sides or specifics aspects of visual effects. Yeah. And we can afford to do that in Glasgow for a lot of the reasons that you were outlining. We don't have a big chunk of real estate in Soho.
Yes, I mean, I think those costs are becoming increasingly challenging for studios, actually, and one of the things that has come up on other episodes of the podcast is that those studios that are located in expensive geography like London's West End are thinking now with all this remote working, well, hey, maybe we don't need to do this anymore. Maybe we can do things like Fix do it.
Well, certainly 5 years ago, we felt that it was a very natural disruption in the industry to push certain aspects, non-client facing aspects of the visual effects world to the nations and regions. And it's been obvious, I think, for quite a long time that expensive footprint is going to breed a necessity to have resources elsewhere.
Just to cycle back and look at Sherpa just once more, I did have one last question around this. I think what's apparent with working with a cloud infrastructure, and I think your choices perhaps speak to this, is that spinning up a totally individual pipeline in a cloud format, that is to say, having full control over it and not being reliant on a sort of a Google Zinc or something that's doing a lot of the engine work in behind the scenes in a way that's opaque, but having full control over your pipeline, requires you to field the complexity of all of that, really. And presumably that's what's appealing about Sherpa for you, is that it is going to simplify what would otherwise be quite a complicated process to go through.
I very much hope so. Now, I'm not really the end user. Although I will move my desk into the cloud as well at some point once it's all ready for me to have a look at and test out. But at the moment, your fantastic Lee Danskin and my fantastic Chris Duffy are making the system as idiot-proof as possible. And once they've got to a bit further down the line with that, then the number one idiot will go in and have a look.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up, actually, guys. Colin, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your interesting insights into both Fix and the VFX industry in a wider sense. And Nick, thank you. Thanks for your contributions as well. Always interesting. So that's all we've got time for. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in Sherpa or VFX technology at large, please check the links below.